Good morning. This is Bob Bauer. I am co-chair with Ben Ginsberg of Pillars of the Community, and our mission includes, actually very centrally, bringing community leadership in states and localities together with election officials to understand how elections work, to ask questions that they need to ask on behalf of themselves and the network of people that they work with most closely and know the best, and to fundamentally help us understand how elections are conducted, how professional administration of elections in the United States works. So I am delighted on behalf of Ben and myself to welcome today Blake Evans, who is the elections director for the state of Georgia. He has deep and extensive experience in election administration, having previously also been the election chief in Fulton County, Georgia, and having worked before that in election administration in Florida. And so I want to welcome you, Blake. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Bob. Excited to be here.
So I want to get straight to the question of sort of your daily life right now. You are preparing for midterm elections and preparing for them in this era of intense interest in how elections in the United States are professionally administered, questions about voter access, voter eligibility, accuracy, reliability. And so I want to just begin by giving readers a sense of, or listeners, a sense of, on a day-to-day basis, what are the component parts of what you need to do to prepare for elections in the state of Georgia?
Well, first of all, it's an exciting time to be an election official in Georgia. It seems like we are running elections 24/7 in one capacity or another. Just a little bit about Georgia and the way that we run elections. We do have the second most counties in the entire country, second only to Texas, so we have 159 here. And our counties and our county election officials really run the elections here in the state of Georgia. And then at the state level, we support them and we oversee the conduct of their elections and certify elections at the state level. And we really have had just about every month going back for almost the past year, some sort of state or federal election being conducted. We're just coming off of our statewide general primary election, where we had the Republican Party and the Democratic parties put up candidates for U.S. Senate, for governor, Secretary of State, Lieutenant Governor, and on down the line. We had about 2 million voters show up to vote in the May 19th general primary election. Here in Georgia, we had at least 17 days of early voting going up to the primary election. So that's in-person early voting, where for 3 weeks voters can show up at any early voting location in their county. And then we also had, of course, election day voting, and then we also have no excuse absentee voting. So we had about 2 million people show up for that. And then 4 weeks after that, we had our runoff election for Republican U.S. Senate and also Republican governor and some other contests as well. And then also on the Democratic side, Democratic lieutenant governor and others. And so our counties did a really great job running those elections. After the elections, it's not like the work ends after election day. We do report results quickly, and so voters are able to see their results, see if their candidate won or if their candidate lost, and know who's going to be advancing to the November election pretty quickly. But in the aftermath of the election, really the election officials still have a lot of work to do. They conducted multiple audits following both of those elections. We run risk limiting audits here in the state of Georgia, and so after each of those elections, our county election officials have conducted 2 risk limiting audits following both of those elections, and that's where they are looking manually at some randomly selected batches of ballots that are selected based on a statistical degree of confidence. And they review those, they create a manual tally from those, and that manual tally gets compared to the machine count from those. And so that's 2 contests after both of those elections. And then we also do what we call a ballot image audit, which is where the images that are taken by the voting equipment are reviewed, the human readable text on those ballots are reviewed, and it audits every single contest across the state. And so our counties do those. They also do the normal canvassing procedures to certify the election. And so they've done just a tremendous job. And so the conduct of an election never really stops. It doesn't end on election night. It starts well before an election. Counties are already getting prepared for November, so it really starts months before, even years before in some cases, and then continues many, many days following the election. And so our county election officials do a tremendous job, and that's kind of what they've been in the middle of the last several weeks.
Well, that is a lot. Let me ask you an overall structural question. You mentioned that your office, the state of Georgia, supervises and supports the counties. Can you talk a little bit about what that relationship is? What kind of support is provided, given that the counties themselves are responsible for administering the elections on the ground?
Absolutely. So I've been really fortunate to work for Secretary Raffensperger, who's been just a tremendous leader for our office. And since I've been with the office since 2020, he's really done a great job of leading us and strengthening our relationship between us and the counties. We work on a daily basis in supporting our county election officials, so they're really the ones on the ground that store the voting equipment, that manage the voting equipment, that train their poll workers, that make sure that everything's ready to go and be deployed for upcoming elections. And so they're managing a lot of the logistics and doing a lot of the boots on the ground work, and we're very grateful for them. On the voter registration side, they're the ones that process voter registrations. They do the vast majority of the maintenance of the voter rolls, and so they're actually processing the applications and doing that work. At the state level, we oversee the processes and we support them. We manage the statewide voter registration database, which we recently implemented a new voter registration system here and rolled it out in 2023. And so we modernized that process, tried to work with our county election officials to make sure it's a system they can really function with. We also deploy and manage a lot of the public-facing tools that voters use. So like we have a My Voter page where they can go and see their polling locations and that kind of thing. We modernized that. And then we also modernized a lot of our data analytics. And we have a data hub on our website that folks can go to and see turnout numbers. They can see voter registration statistics. And so really our job is about supporting the counties, providing overall guidance and support to the election officials as they run the elections.
Question about early voting, the first phase of the voting process here, and the number of days, significant number of days that people can early vote. Just ballpark, how many people early voted this year in the primary process?
We typically see about half in the general primary. We saw about half of our voters that showed up to vote before election day. In a November election, I expect that number to really go up to over half. I believe in 2024, in that presidential election where we had a little over 5 million voters cast ballots, it was over 3.5 million that voted during our 3 weeks of advanced voting. But for the general primary, it was about half. And so a lot of our electorate that we see, a lot of our voters, they like to vote in person and they like to vote in the days before election day. And we typically see over 3 weeks, we see a large surge at the beginning with folks getting out to vote. And then we see a large surge at the end as folks are trying to go vote before the early voting period ends.
And did any particular unanticipated issues develop in this last early voting period? How did that go?
We didn't see any new issues or anything in particular pop up that I would deem noteworthy. Our voting system that we've used since 2020, and so our counties are very accustomed to using it. Our poll workers are very accustomed to using it. It's been battle tested, as we like to say. It's been thoroughly audited, so we know that it works and that the machines count the votes accurately. And so it was really a pretty seamless process. We see very little, very short to no waits during advanced voting. Sometimes on the last day and the last afternoon, as folks are who may have waited to the last minute and want to get their vote in. before advanced voting ends. We see some lines pop up here and there. But other than that, really very short to no waits. And even on election day, our average wait is usually somewhere around 2 to 5 minutes.
So, in your capacity as election director, but also in what you hear from county administrators, what are the most common questions or concerns that come your way that you find you have to answer? You don't need to rank them precisely, but just generally speaking, what do you find voters most want to know? What questions sort of most grab their attention?
A lot of it is some of the basic stuff, and especially folks that one of the great things about our elections here in our country is that they're very diverse and from even one state to another. And so we do often see voters that move from a neighboring state, maybe Alabama or Florida, as you mentioned earlier. I worked in Florida, and the way that each state runs their elections is really very different. And so we get many questions that are just very basic from voters. How do I register to vote? How do I vote? And how do I vote in the state of Georgia? I'm new. Those are some of the questions that we get from voters, and most of them, again, just very basic. Our county election officials, we have really a great group of county election officials. We saw, I would say, over the last 5 years, a decent amount of turnover. So a lot of new election officials that have come into our state and that are really doing a great job. Some of them work their way up from a data entry clerk, and now they're running their office. Some we've seen instances where people have come from one state into Georgia, and we're excited to have them here. And so we've seen some turnover over the last 5 years. That really seemed to, over the last year or two, kind of flatlined, and we've been able to keep a lot of the experience that we've gained, which is good. But we do frequently conduct trainings with our county election officials on some of the things that we do emphasize are the maintenance of our voter rolls. We do try to do obviously daily maintenance, which is the processing of those applications, the processing of deceased records, and so we train on that, processing of felon records that we get from the Department of Corrections, and make sure that our counties are well trained on that and that they don't have any questions there. But we also do systematic list maintenance, which are more mass mailers, and so we train on those as well. And so we do get some questions about our list maintenance practices here in the state of Georgia from our voters. How do we keep the voter rolls clean? And it's really, the way that I explain it to people is there's not one magic silver bullet out there that if you just do this one thing, your voter rolls will stay clean. It's really combining multiple efforts and making sure that you're doing all of them in a way that complies with state and federal law. That's really over time going to keep your voter rolls clean. And so we use state resources here, like our Department of Driver Services that has Real ID and verifies citizenship. We use their resources to make sure that we only have citizens on the voter rolls. We use sources like the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC, to get cross-state data. We use that data to capture folks when they move from the state of Georgia to another ERIC member state. We even get data from our Department of Driver Services when somebody moves to another state and gives up their Georgia license to get a license in a new state. And so we really try to use all the resources that are available to us, and then make sure that our county election officials are well trained on how to use that data and that resources, and to make sure that we're maintaining our voter rolls.
So in many respects, and it's a complex system, and you're a professional election administrator, you work with professional election administrators. You also give voters a real look at the system, I take it, which is to say, if they have questions, you answer them. They're also able, if I understand it, for example, in the various counties, to participate in facility tours so they can actually see the setup, where observers will be stationed, how the processes in fact work. Is that the case? I want to make sure that's accurate.
That's 100% the case. So many of our processes that we have are written into law in a way that they're intended to be transparent. And so, like before every election, the voting equipment that gets used in that election gets tested. That part is public. Um, Within the election process, once it starts, there are designated poll watchers that candidates and campaigns and political parties can designate to say these people are going to have additional access to be able to view the voting process. But even within a voting location itself, there's a designated public area. And then after the election, I mentioned those audits. That part of the process is also open to the public. So really, from beginning to end, those that process is, or that process from beginning to end is open to the public, so that members of the public can see what election officials are doing.
Well, that brings me to the question, and another question about community engagement. We often hear from election officials that they encourage people who have an intense interest, maybe along the way questions about how the process works, to sign up to be poll workers, to actually assist election officials in the discharge of their duties. How many poll workers across the many counties in the state of Georgia that administer elections, just ballpark, how many poll workers do they need? How many poll workers are they able to recruit? And can you just generally describe what the duty of a poll worker would be?
Absolutely. So statewide, in a large election, our county election officials will use combined between 10 and 15,000 poll workers throughout early voting and election day to run the election process. And being a poll worker is a great way to get involved and to really get a greater understanding of the process. It doesn't take a lot of time to do it. There's a training opportunity on the front end that's required, and then there's election day, and the bulk of the responsibility comes on the day of the election. It is a very long day. Poll workers get to their polling locations by 6 a.m. and then polls don't close until 7 p.m. And then even after the polls close, there's work to be done to make sure that all the paperwork's buttoned up, to do the reconciliation processes, to verify that the number of check-ins matches the number of ballots cast and that sort of thing. So it's a late night as well, but it's a great way if people have questions about the process or want to understand it at a deeper level to be involved. And there's a variety of different poll workers. Usually the position that many people that are going to be a first-time poll worker come into is what we call a clerk. And so that's where they're checking identification when a voter comes in. They're checking people in on the poll book. And then as they advance through that process and run an election or two, they might step up into an assistant manager or a poll manager role, where they're overseeing a team of 5, 6, or 7 poll workers, and they're making sure that the paperwork is done properly. But usually that position is for the more seasoned individuals that have 3, 4, 5 elections or more under their belt. And so it's a great way to get involved, to really understand the process. And our election officials do need a lot of good folks to really participate in the process in order to run the election. I think I heard one state house representative put it in the perspective of businesses, and on an election day, our elections community would go into the top 100 businesses, I believe, in the state of Georgia, just in terms of size, which is really pretty incredible when you think about Georgia has businesses like Home Depot and Delta and others here. But in terms of size, it's a massive operation, really, when you look at it from a state perspective.
Yes, I do want to add, and Ben's not here to join me in thanking you, but in our Pillars program, we have community leaders who want to engage with elections, understand how professional election administration works, ask questions, and we have found, and so I'm going to urge anyone who's listening to us today to understand, election officials, in our experience, are always ready to listen, always ready to answer questions. The transparency, and I've been in this business a long time, the level of transparency has increased exponentially over time. And there are formal programs and just general informal practices of engaging with the community, as certainly our pillars have come to understand in the state of Georgia and elsewhere. Let me ask you a question about changes in the law. And I understand there have been in the state of Georgia. In fact, I know there have been, and that they have added to your planning responsibilities for 2028 as well as the 2026 midterms. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned earlier, just to go back a few years, I started in the office in 2020, and then we had the Election Integrity Act in 2021 that really was that impacted our law in a major way and changed many of the ways that we run elections here in the state of Georgia. And then recently, we did have a special session here in the state of Georgia that just ended last week, where essentially our legislature has decided to put together a study committee. They didn't call it a study committee, but it's basically a committee to do research, talk to experts in the field of elections, to determine and to make a recommendation to the legislature about how Georgia will vote in 2028 and beyond. And so their recommendation is supposed to be made to our legislature by January of next year. So that's when the legislature comes back in for their general session. And so they'll make the recommendation, and then from that point, the General Assembly will determine how they might want to change the laws so that according to make a decision on how Georgia voters will vote in the 2028 presidential cycle and beyond. So we'll see what they want to do. We have a great system that we have been using since 2020, and that's our ballot marking device system where voters go in. As I said earlier, vast majority of voters like to vote in person on a ballot marking device. It prints out a summary ballot, and then that ballot gets scanned. We've audited this system to an incredible degree. We know for sure that it works. So it's been a very good system for us. So we'll see what the legislature wants to do. If they want to keep a system like that, or if they want to move to hand-marked paper ballots, which many jurisdictions around the country use and do a very good job of running elections. But that recommendation does have to be made by this committee that was created by the legislature in the special session. They've got to make the recommendations by January, and then the General Assembly will decide from there how Georgia voters will be casting ballots in 2028. But essentially for the next year and a half, it's going to look a whole lot like what it's looked like since 2020. Another change that was in that bill that created that committee was also that our number of risk limiting audits that get conducted after elections will expand. And so I mentioned earlier, we do 2 contests after most elections. And with this new change in the law, we'll do statewide 20 contests, which will be a significant increase. We'll do 20 RLAs. That'll include our 14 congressional districts in November, plus 6 statewide positions. So we'll also, it increased the number of contests that we audit as well.
So the long and short of it is you're not planning any lengthy vacations over the next 18 months.
That's right. We've got a lot of training coming up with our county election officials, and then absentee ballots will start going out to our military and overseas voters in September for the November election. Early voting will run in October, and then we'll have the statewide election in November. So a lot of prep work to do. County election officials are already beginning it, or have already begun it. They're in the middle of it. So no vacations coming up anytime soon.
Well, we appreciate your taking the time with us today. We're very grateful. On behalf of our pillars, the community leaders in Georgia who've engaged with you, I want to thank you for all of the courtesies that you've extended our way and the information you've provided. On behalf of Ben, thank you for joining us today, and good luck in the time ahead. The work that you do is extraordinarily important, and everybody's grateful for your service.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.